Welcome to Aleatory Encounters, a SteinerBooks podcast. What you are about to listen to is an audio snapshot of an in-person human conversation that took place here at our offices in Spencertown, New York. In this episode, with Patrick Doyle. The thing that gets me is that you're excited about life. It's like, let's do this thing. So I was kind of interested in your approach to living and doing.
You know, the experience of the earth being, or the being of the earth, or the beingness of the earth, is probably one of the central themes that I've been working with for decades. And what is that? And of course, our teacher Steiner speaks about the earth being. And so it's like, well, what is that? Well, one of the things that completely envelops one who's on this earth is that it's so rich and incredible. And how can you not be excited about being on the earth? Holy mackerel, man. This is like, whoa. So, yeah, how do you perceive what is going on in your very life right now, in this instant? And how does that work? How do you fit in that? Or how do you ride that wave? And of course, the biggest thing that is unseen are these beings of the spiritual world, which have such a tremendous impact and have so much that manifests from them that the discovery of it in one's own life, in one's biography, is an ecstatic thing. And to do biography work, it's a constant rediscovering of what those spiritual beings do in the manifestation of this instant on the being of the earth.
Does it matter what you do?
It most certainly matters what one does.
How does this manifest in your life, professionally, or or out of necessity?
Well, I think it begins with, of course, our childhood and how we have been graced with whatever the events of our parents and our family, etc. And one of the deep understandings that I have had since I can remember, my earliest remembrances, are fairies and the appearance and the reality of these fairy beings, and that they're everywhere.
Is that right?
All the time. It's overwhelming to go back and to think about those times and to think about one's progression through childhood into adolescence and adulthood up until now, and the appearance of these invisible forces, which we call fairies, which is so apparent to me, as was initially introduced to me by my grandmother, and which was nurtured and continued by my mother. Yeah.
Did you forget about them in any time in your life?
Yes, because there was a moment when I was 11, we moved from Joplin, Missouri to Lakeland, Florida. And that was 1962 in the summer. In the fall of 1962, in October, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the Cuban Missile Crisis in Lakeland, Florida, because it was next to Tampa, 40 miles, was designated the escape place for people who would be coming from the atomic war that was going to be started, because that was going to happen. And so in Lakeland, we actually practiced walking a mile away from our school so we wouldn't block the traffic for the survivors of the atomic bomb in Tampa. So my family believed and thought that we were going to be in World War III. And as an 11-year-old, I was like, what is going on here? My fairy understanding was that this couldn't happen. Now, if you fast forward to when I was 16, this has everything to do with the forgetting of my fairies. I and my brother, who was my roommate, we talked about God and about praying to God before we went to bed. And we'd lay in our beds and we would do our different things. And my brother has become an agnostic. He is an atheist. But at that time, at 16, I'm laying in my bed and I was starting to do astral projection. And I'm lying there on my bed and I went up out of my body to touch the meniscus, is what I call it, of wind. And I knew that if I went through that meniscus, I would be eliminated, or that my life would be over as I knew it. But that was also the gate to connect with the Spirit of God. And it frightened me so deeply, I went back into my bed and I forgot all of that until I was 21, when a similar experience revived the memory. And that's when I deeply started to work with the spiritual world as it relates to the fairies or the hidden spiritual forces. And that set the pace, really, for the rest of my life. And that incident that happened when I was 21, I was following a book on how to astral travel. And so I was using it. And I was abusing it. Because I also was so drawn to it and did it so much that another experience that I had after that revelation was that there was this man who I actually was, we were rooming in a house that we had renovated and were paying $15 a month. Had a WPA outhouse and we had to tote the water from the woman's house next door. And but he was a drunk. But he had traveled a lot of India and he definitely had powers. He was doing something to me. He was manipulating me psychically somehow. And so I was in the downstairs room in this 100-year-old Tennessee house, and he was directly above me in the attic that he had renovated. And next door, the room next door, was supposedly a slave room that was moved from up the hill, which every night there would be noises in that room, and I would have my rows of boots and different things, and I would throw things into it to quiet down these ghosts. So there was a lot in this house that was stirred up. Well, this particular time, I decided that this guy was messing with me. And so instead of going on an astral travel, I went up into his mind. And as I went up into his mind, he screamed at the top of his lungs. And it was like a wave of water just pushed me down. And I couldn't get up from my bed. I don't know how long it took to get up. I finally got up, went up the stairs, and he's sitting up in his bed and he's got his hands out like this and he's going, "Get away from me." And I said, "Don't you ever do that again or I will kill you." And so that particular spell was broken. But what it did was it gave me some sort of strange power or an understanding of a power, and I misused it. But my astral travel continued. And it wasn't until a year later that I was up in Milwaukee visiting my Austrian girlfriend. I was in the basement and I was doing astral travel. And I did this astral travel and came back. And at the foot of my bed was a figure that was naked that looked like me. I call it my doppelganger. And he said, "Don't ever do that again. Ever again." And so I stopped my astral travel, needless to say. But what it did was to launch me on a path of seeking what these things were that were not of the sensual world. And that was a serious drive. Maybe it was my central drive of my life. So when I was on the river working for the U.S. Corps of Engineers doing survey work, I ended up in New Orleans. And I had started interacting with this woman on the street who sold flowers. And she said, "Do you want to go to a psychic convention?" And I said, "Okay." And so we went to this convention. And I walk into that room, and it was like, there were like 100 doppelgangers in there. It was like crazy. I have never experienced anything like that in my life. You could feel the electricity in this room and all these different people. And I actually met an astrologer and he was a numbers guy, a numerologist. And on the way back from that convention, we went into a bookstore, and I bought P.D. Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous and the New Model of the Universe. And that was the beginning of an intellectual understanding of a path to understand what the elementals, the fairies, and the hidden spirits are.
Uh-huh. Are you familiar with the fairy tale that's told, I believe, in the second mystery drama?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Of the Rock Spring Wonder and the boy who is in touch with this fairy world. It's quite beautiful.
It is.
But it seems like you were closer in the in-between.
Yeah. Well, there was real danger. I was in danger.
That would have been in the 1960s, early 1970s.
Yeah, that's right. It was 1972.
How does this lead to an encounter with the modern spiritual science of Rudolf Steiner?
Well, I lived a lifetime or two before I met Steiner.
Yeah.
I was 55 when I met Steiner.
Yeah.
That was the beginning of a ride that, unbeknownst to me, I was going towards working with theater and acting and things, but I had no idea because I didn't get much exposure at all to those things.
To which things?
I went to 4 different high schools, and I never saw a performance of a theater piece in high school because none of my high schools had theater. You know, I just wasn't exposed at all. In my college life, I was pre-med, but I was really protest. Mm-hmm. That was what I was. It was Vietnam War stuff. And so after my second tour with the U.S. Corps of Engineers on the Mississippi River, which was, talk about being connected to the elementals, holy mackerel, man. It was 12 hours a day, 12 days on, 2 days off, in the wilds of the Mississippi River, between the levees with a 4-wheel drive vehicle and a 16-foot boat. And we were either on quarter boats that floated down the river with the revetment project, or we were out ahead of it doing the survey stuff. I was in the wilds. It was amazing. Probably did a few more mushrooms than I probably should have, but that was always, they were always there because it was on the levee, you know, down where all the mushrooms stuff. But the thing is that after my second season with the Corps, I became very depressed, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I said, well, I was in Memphis at the time, I'll just leave and go to Florida, where we actually lived when I was younger, and moved to Lakeland. But Lakeland and all that area is in the phosphate mines, that whole area. And my father was an agricultural chemical process engineer, big management guy with W.R. Grace. And in fact, in my first year at college, I was a urea operator. I became a chemical operator because that was a deal that Grace worked out with employees and their sons and whatever. So basically an ammonia plant, taking nitrogen out of the air and making urea prills that would be fertilizer. Mm-hmm. So high pressure. But anyway, that qualified me to apply to be a sulfuric acid operator in the phosphate mines in Florida. So sulfuric acid is used to digest the phosphoric rock that they're mining down there. And so I went down and they were de-mothballing a sulfuric acid plant. There were actually 2 of them. And my father, who trained under a man called Mr. Sulfuric, I mean, that was his expertise, was sulfuric acid. So he says, Patrick, you can't de-mothball a sulfuric acid plant. That's not possible. So I said, well, that's what we're doing. So these guys were basically pulling a fast one. What happened was, as an energetic 20-something, I got in, and the basic audition for it was we had to crawl through these big pipes that would hold diammonium phosphate. You had to have an oxygen mask on and a pick, and you're doing all this stuff. And I was maniacal in my physique. I was really I was fearless. So I went in and doing all that stuff, and they hired me on the spot. He said, okay. And then they said, which plant do you want to work under? And they had the one that was kind of up and running and the other one that was not. And I said, I'll work on the one that's not. And so I became a sulfuric acid operator. But what's interesting about it is that in order to make sulfuric acid, you have to take elemental sulfur and make it molten at 350 degrees, and it's pumped to where the plant is itself, which is like maybe 100 yards. So there's this huge pit of molten yellow sulfur. It's really astounding. So it has to be heated so it can liquefy. And then it's pumped at pressure into the furnace that has a baffle, and the sulfur hits the baffle. And as it hits the baffle, it's on fire because it's in the furnace. And you see this purple blue flame. It's like, wow. And that's creating SO2. So it's creating literally the most poisonous thing you can possibly imagine. And that is an exothermic reaction that then has to go through a waste heat boiler so that it can cool it down, so that it can go into a catalytic converter so it can change it to SO3. And then it does the same thing again until it goes to the next level, which then becomes H2SO4. But there's a whole thing involved with that. So I was kind of involved in the chemical world, but it also triggered me about alchemy. I mean, it was like, wow, this is amazing. This is like magical. And it was. The chemical processing is so magical because of the huge quantities and what is going on. And they really don't control it. You don't really control it. So you have these different gates and valves that you're maneuvering the gas to go through, and the liquid is getting so hot that it turns to steam, and the entire complex is run by the steam generated from the waste heat of the creation of the exothermic reactions, and it just goes on. And I was fascinated with that. It was like I wanted to know everything about it. I wanted to know where every pipe and whistle and everything was. But what happened was, this plant that wasn't really supposed to be revived was having its troubles. And the electricians had come into the control room, the blockhouse, and opened up the breaker door for the water pump, because the water pump was what creates all the water in order to cool things down and blah, blah, blah. But the steam pump was so old that it couldn't be revived, and they were running the plant on a temporary electric motor to put the water into the thing. There was no backup. And unbeknownst to me, they had disconnected the shutoff valve. So I'm there doing you have to do a round every hour, and you write down all the different gauges, and you go out into the plant, you're in the control room, you can do all these different things. And I'm out actually on the water softeners, which is diatomaceous earth in these giant vessels. And so I'm doing a reverse thing on the water, because the water can't have any minerals in the furnace, because if it does, it means it deteriorates and clogs, and oh my God, and it's SO2. So I'm out on top of this thing, and I start hearing, now this thing's noisy, everything's noisy, and I start hearing these noises. I'm going, what the heck is this? So I get down and I start walking towards the blockhouse, and the boiler is there, and there's a tube that shows you how much water is in it, and it's lit underneath. The meniscus is lit underneath so that you can see the level of what the water is. And I see it and I go, oh my God, it must mean there's too much water in there. I can't see the meniscus. Mm-hmm. I go into the control room and I bang on the thing, and it's like showing it too high, and then it goes down to nothing. This is the same thing that happened at 3 Mile Island, by the way. So I'm like, whoa, the sulfur pump is still going and there's no water in the boiler. Oh, 2,300 degrees. It could melt the whole thing down. So I pound on the siren and I run 100 yards to turn off the sulfur pump manually, because the whole friggin' thing is about ready to completely melt down. Turn it off, run back. And the supervisor comes in and he goes, well, you did the right thing. Now we got to get water in there. I said, water in the empty furnace? Are you out of your mind? Or the boiler? And he goes, yeah, you got to get water in there. And we had a gravity feed thing called the aerator. And he says, now you just get there and you just crack it open and then shut it immediately. And I go, are you sure? He says, yeah. So he's at the blockhouse. I'm there like an idiot standing there going, should I really be here? And so I go, and the whole plant shakes like an earthquake. And I look over and my supervisor has got his head out the blockhouse and he goes, it's okay now. And he walks up and he says, if it would have blown up, that would have been when it would have blown up, and now it's okay. Anyway, the power of steam, the power of super steam, the power of the forces of these huge amounts of heat and all these different things really put the stuff in me. And at that point, I wrote up 3 pages of safety infractions, and I went around the plant to get people to sign, and nobody would sign it. And so I'm going, well, what am I going to do? And my friend down the street, a sociologist, retired, Dr. Schuler, kind of a famous sociologist, actually. He said, Patrick, you're just going to write this and say you're going to go to the OSHA and everything else, and you're just going to hand it to them by yourself. And so I did. And the next shift, the president of the company came in, and the whole room in the headquarters was filled with all these muckety-mucks, and they said, thank you for your service. We really appreciate what you've done, and we will fix everything in the next 24 hours. And they did. And so, but I'm walking around, all the workers, they were too afraid, and it was like, why am I here? So I turned in my resignation 2 weeks shy of my year there, and sold everything I had and went to South America. But that was the beginning, really, John Scott, of my work with what I called alchemy. It really got me more curious about how all these things work and how they can manifest. And the industrial chemical world has all kinds of magical things that happen that people can't explain. They can't explain what's going on. Well, it's happening. Mm-hmm. We don't know what it is. The physicists and the chemists, they really can't tell you everything that's going on, because all of these actions and reactions and catalysts and different things are happening, and pressures. It's just what it works. Uh-huh. And of course, what screws it up most of the time are human error. Uh-huh. So that put me on a path of questioning these things. And when I went to South America, I ended up my second trip to South America off the coast of Honduras in Utila, which was one of the Bay Islands, Roatan, Guanaja, and Utila, where Columbus first landed. And I was snorkeling. I'd never snorkeled before, and I was snorkeling in this incredible water. You would go off the reef. It was fire coral. You could see 200 feet down. It was like you were flying. You could see the shadows of the sharks and the different stuff. And so this guy from California taught me more stuff, and he said, well, have you ever dove the chimneys? And I said, well, what's the chimneys? And the chimneys were these shafts that were completely covered with fire coral, all the way down to a level which was basically 1 atmosphere, 33 feet. And there was a shelf on the outside. So now I'm free diving, and I was really getting good at it, and I could hold my breath, 3-4 minutes, because this guy taught me how to do it. You can get an extra breath when you go down 33 feet because it compresses basically on you. So we go down to that, and we would see a shaft of light coming down through this chimney, and you go into it, and then you would go up to get your breath. But in order to keep from hitting the fire coral, you had to do like a jackknife to go back down after you'd got your breath, or it would cut you. And you go down, and then you come out, and you're... So it was a thrill. I was a thrill seeker. It was wild, crazy. And because of that, I think it was also because of my breath and all this different stuff, I started having these waking hallucinations. And so I'm in my shack out on top of the salt flats or whatever, and it had these shutter windows. And one night, something came down next to my head, and I can't even describe what it was, but it was some sort of object. And as I turned around and looked out the door, there were millions of fire fairies coming towards me. It was like I was a rock in the middle of the stream, and they were going around me. And I'm like, wow. And then I get up and I run towards the door where they were coming from. And then they just all went up, and all I saw was the stars in the sky. And so that was like, it was an affirmation of something. But it also made me want to move on land like I did in the water. And so I became a ballet dancer. I went back to Memphis, and I started taking ballet lessons at the age of 23 or whatever. Because I was a swimmer and in good shape, I could do things, but I couldn't do things like the ballerinas who are 12 years old and would run circles around me. But I became a ballet dancer, and that was my launch into theater. From survey to sulfuric acid to skin diving to ballet.
Yeah. There's also a close connection to processes, in a way alchemical, or the combustions and the things that are powering.
The fire has everything to do with it.
Yeah.
And of course the water. And then the air. And then the minerals. All those things. So what's interesting is that I was rereading the warmth course. And he speaks about, of course, the air and the fluids and the solids and the minerals and all those different things. And there's this transmogrification that's always occurring, especially the in-between places of air and water, or gas and fluid and those. And this is the connection. I'm convinced that this is the reason I chose my parents, is that my father, having this chemical engineering thing, my mother was a medical technologist. And as I'm reading the warmth course, it's like, oh my God, this has everything to do with my understanding of things. And so I'll flash forward to 2003, when I became the CEO and president of my father's technological invention company. And it was called the Chattanooga process, or as he said, the Chattanooga process. And it was about the Chattanooga Lake that was under the area of Chattanooga that was the oil shale. And he invented a system of having oil shale be processed into a feedstock for refineries by way of hydrogen. So by definition, it had to be under pressure. It was not a retort. It was actually a pressurized thing that you couldn't pollute because it was pressurized, and it didn't use water. It was actually the key to the Athabasca tar sand in Canada, and the government of Canada said, this is it. This is it. This is what's going to change everything. The invention really worked. We had a pilot plant that the government of Canada had subsidized in the INCUT, the Center for Upgrading Technology. And so we're in there. I mean, this is really crazy. Here I am, an actor, raising money for patent lawyers and crap like that, and interfacing with chemists and physicists and stuff. And we're in this pilot plant control room. And it's going through the process under pressure. You can't see it. And you see the graphs and you're seeing all this stuff happen. It's like, oh my God, this is really working. And what was working was it was a fluid bed of solids. So the oil shale that they were using as the example, because the bitumen from the tar sands, we couldn't use that yet. So we used the oil shale, pulverized it, and had the hydrogen coming up through the vessel that started to agitate the fine particles, so that the fine particles of solid started acting like a fluid, and it would achieve a fluid bed and therefore act as a fluid even though it was a solid. Steiner speaks very specifically about these transition points of fluid and gas. And he says what science has missed from it is that what we call heat and energy balance in the scientific industrial world is not addressing what warmth is. And that's where it misses it. Now, I'm sitting in this control room. This is before I met Steiner's work. And I'm looking around at these, PhDs in chemistry. And I said, what's going on here? And they went, we don't know. We just don't know what makes it happen. So here I am in this control room for this invention that my father has done, me having experience as a urea and sulfuric acid operator, having a real on-the-ground understanding of these processes, as my father would say. And so the invention was basically a full industrial chemical process with a Klaus sulfur extractor and all these different things. And basically there would be no stack, and all the meany, nasty stuff would be taken out, separated, and placed in different things. And it could create a clean feedstock for the refineries without water or air pollution. Well, you would think that would be a winner. No, because the industry made sure it didn't happen. They squashed every single thing, and in fact took all of the operators and the brains of the Center for Upgrading Technology and basically hired them out. And so they stripped the research of everybody, and we could never get the next level. We couldn't get what's called a verification of the process, because you have to have an outside entity come in and say, yes, that bottle of whatever is what came from that plant. And it would cost $1 million to have that verification. So the whole thing, it didn't work. And so it died because there was no economy to push it, even though it was absolutely the best thing according to Canada. The interesting thing to me is that Steiner continually talks about how science ignores what really is the essential of these understandings of gas, fluids, and solids, and that it's warmth, not heat. Because again, in the industrial world, it's heat and energy balance. It's the second law of thermodynamics. It's all that stuff. It doesn't explain it. It just doesn't explain it. And the PhDs are going, well, we just don't know. Because they're not including a key element of it. So that brings me to a point. My father always said that you can have clean coal. He said this from when I was a teenager. He says it just costs you a lot to do it. You can do it. The technology's been around a long time. And what's going on now in our world is that the so-called alternative green energies of wind and solar, we won't count hydroelectric for the moment because there's a whole nother thing going on with that. But you can't, electricity cannot be stored. Now, you can store it with a battery and different stuff like that, but when you generate electricity, it has to go somewhere. It has to be used. The grid won't work unless every second is accounted for and we know where that electricity is going. But the grid has to be able to accept it. Now, it takes a lot of energy and money to make it so that the grid can accept it because of it's called dirty electricity. It bounces back and forth. So you can't get a steady frequency that allows it to go into the grid system. It has to be stomped on. If you have your own solar thing in your house, the most expensive thing is this thing that allows it to go into the grid. So when they get the spikes in the electricity, they can't use it all. But they have to get rid of it in order for the thing to function. The inefficiency of this stuff is based on the understanding of fire. Okay, the solar is not burning. But you've got all of the minerals that have to be mined to make it. You've got aluminum, which takes the highest amount of energy of any metal to make. So you've got these unbelievable amounts of energy to make the green energy saving for us. So it's the burning that gets us in trouble. And so the burning, as I know from an old chemical plant operator, the nasties are mainly dumped out in the startup because it's not up to its efficient heat and energy balance. So whenever I would drive to my shift for the sulfuric acid plant, the first thing you're looking at is the stack. If the stack is clear, everything is okay. If the stack has something coming out, there's something wrong and we're going to have to do something and it ain't going to be fun. You breathe in that stuff. Mm-hmm. They told you only wear polyester because cotton, of course, will deteriorate from the sulfuric acid that's in the air and different. And I liked wearing blue jeans, and I always had blue jeans that were full of holes. So what is the most important thing? The elemental beings are always here. And the forces that those beings are a part of and flow in are always at work, even though we don't see them. And so how does that manifest in an understanding of thinking? And to me, this is totally related to that moment when I was 11 years old and asked, we're going to do what? We're going to have a world war with nuclear weapons? Well, what? That makes no sense. So my newest project, Vortex Hiroshima Nagasaki, has everything to do with what is the thought of those who control these things, or maybe don't control, but that are in the stream of whatever is coming to humanity. So the so-called Promethean moment of the discovery of fission was instantaneous across the earth. All the physicists, all the chemists, when that was published that happened, they all knew exactly they could make a bomb. All of them. And in my favorite historian, Richard Rhodes, who wrote The Making of the Atomic Bomb, he said every country that has ever wanted to make an atomic bomb has done so on the first try. On the first try. So, the invisible forces, that which is invisible, the spiritual forces, are what is keeping things in balance. And yet, we talk with a casualness about, well, maybe nuclear bombs or nuclear war and all that. This is insanity. But the fairies are still here. And the forces that we don't understand, that help us all the time, and can also be the forces that give us a pathway to that which is the most destructive. The forces, they're not in conspiracy. We are the ones that are in conspiracy.
I mean, the very last communication that Rudolf Steiner gave, in the last leading thought written on his deathbed, where he really pointed to the realm of subnature, which we're entering, which is the realm of electricity. Yeah. And the deeper we go into that, the further into the supersensible realm the human being must go to awaken a human spiritual consciousness rather than be drawn down into a subnatural sphere.
In order for humanity to achieve its place in the hierarchy, we have to hold the hand of the fairy and hold the hand of our angel. And that makes the connection.
You've been listening to Aleatory Encounters, a SteinerBooks podcast. You can find more about what we do, what you've just heard, and the books we publish at SteinerBooks.org.